Hello, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type out your question. And now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. A lot to get through today, lots going on here. As I've said to some of the regular listeners in the past, I'm asked to give a title for this week's webinar sometimes, days and days in advance. So I have to pick a topic and hope that nothing else will happen. Well, that rarely does, so I was asked to write a title, I think it was Saturday night. And at that point, the big news was that just before late on Friday, just before the Sabbath, there was a relatively shocking resignation by a relatively senior government minister, a member of Blue and White, someone very much from the left flank of Blue and White, Asaf Zamir, who is the tourism minister. Well, you can argue what really is a tourism minister doing these days, but regardless, he basically resigned because of what he said is the government's failures on dealing with the coronavirus, on the economy. He pointed very much a finger at the Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was a very strange timing on a Friday afternoon. It's not the best, certainly probably the worst time of the week to make any sort of declarations like that, because it's outside a little bit of the news cycle, because then there's not another paper, a physical paper, until Sunday, although obviously publications online are being updated. So it was a very strange timing and a lot of questions around that, but it certainly put a lot of pressure on Benny Gantz. And there is certainly in the Blue and White Party a growing number of ministers who are questioning their continued presence in this government. And there's even talk of maybe even a breakaway led by some who, again, possibly could be construed as more to the left of the party itself, certainly left to Benny Gantz's left and some others. But again, while that should have been the big headline of the week, we've had far bigger headlines since then. On Sunday, it appears that a senior government minister from the Likud, Ghila Gamliel, who is the environment minister, was caught breaking the government's restrictions, the laws, which basically restricts Israelis to 1 kilometer from their house, not attending a synagogue inside, or at least under very, very severe restrictions, not traveling, not being in someone else's home. Well, it appears she broke almost all of those rules. She traveled, I think it was something like 160 kilometers to her parents' or her parents-in-law's place in Tiberias. She went to a synagogue which blatantly contravened the rules. And then when she found out that she had coronavirus, she allegedly lied or kept some information to herself when they tried to understand who she may have been affected by, who she may be infected. She blamed her driver at the point, leaving out her trip to Tiberias. Well, the police now are signaling to the Attorney General to open investigation against her. Because she's a government minister, the Attorney General has to give the green light whether a criminal investigation will be launched against her, because not the fact that she broke the rules, that's you'll just get a fine for, but if it is concluded that she lied to the epidemiological research on it, then that actually is even a prison sentence. So there was a lot of anger about that. 75% of the country, according to polls, said that she should be fired. Put a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. But Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has made very little comment about it, said, let's wait for the investigation to close, sort of handed the health ministry, handed it over to the health ministry. And the health ministry said, no, we don't deal with this side of it. We did our investigation. And that's it. So Netanyahu is trying to wash his hands with this, trying to sort of hope that it will go away, but there's still a lot of anger, as you can imagine, when people are having to close businesses, not being able to visit loved ones, not being able to pray during the holy days, et cetera, et cetera. And here you have a government minister, and it's qualitatively different from. There was another member of Knesset from Yesh Atid, from the opposition, who also broke the rules during the High Holy Days. But my belief is it's qualitatively different because Gila Gamliel is someone in the cabinet. She hears the discussions. She understands the position. She understands the figures. She hears all the experts, the leading experts of the day, talk about how bad the situation is, and then votes for the most severe restrictions at the moment in the world, and then goes and breaks them. So they are qualitatively different, and you can hear even from people that I know who are strong Likud supporters who absolutely say she should resign or be fired. But she is a relatively powerful figure. She has a family that's very closely related to a lot of senior people in the Likud, and the way the Likud works is usually there are very central people in the Likud party, in their committees, that basically choose who's going to be where on the lists. They call them in Israel kablanim. They're basically the ones who tell people who to vote for. And Gila Gamliel is a very strong figure within that network. So it would be very hard for Netanyahu politically, internally in the Likud to fire her, but morally and ethically, most Israelis certainly believe that she should be fired. Then we had an even bigger shock yesterday. Usually polls come out on a Wednesday. They like to do weekly polls now. If you're going to vote today, who would you vote for? And we spoke last or 2 weeks ago about how Yamina, the party of Naftali Bennett, is closing in on Likud, and there was only 8 seats difference, which is a 4-seat turnover. And that was, quite remarkable. Likud had gone down to below 30. Well, there was a poll yesterday which showed that the gap has narrowed to 2 seats between Naftali Bennett's party and Netanyahu's party. Now, Likud's reaction to that immediately was to put out an image of a previous poll, I believe from about a year or so ago, before one of the many elections we had, that showed that there was a poll that had them even 1 seat away at that time. And in the end, as we know, Yamina really disintegrated and got, in one election, didn't even pass the threshold, and in others, barely passed. There is some substance to that. Naftali Bennett does poll very well, but when it comes to the elections, through various myriad reasons, he doesn't do as well. Part of that is because he has this sort of, I'm a successful businessman, I come from this high-tech background, people from the center and even the center left are attracted to that, and he's been very positive recently on the coronavirus. He comes with a plan. He said, Netanyahu says this could take 6 months to a year to get out of. And Naftali Bennett says, if I was in charge, I could do this in 1 month. And he actually lays out his plan. It's from a communications point of view, it's a very strong message. But at the end of the day, during elections, there's a lot more of a spotlight placed on other people, especially from those who have a vested interest in doing so. And you have other people in the party like Bezalel Smotrich, who is, let's just say he's pretty much as far right as you can be in the current Knesset. And a lot of people might be put off by that and then return to other parties. And also Netanyahu makes a very good claim before every single election who may vote for So I think the polls are interesting, but everyone knows that won't necessarily be the result. But this is where it gets interesting. Even if they are largely wrong, and instead of a 2-seat gap, there's 5, 6, 7 seats, it still puts Bennett into pole position where he knows that there can be no right-wing government without him. And what this does is it puts Netanyahu in a very difficult position. Netanyahu wants to get rid of this rotation, this unity government with Gantz. He wants to get rid of it and go back to his government of right-wing religious parties. But he wants to be in the situation he used to be in, where he's running the show and everyone else is very much junior party in the government, partner even in the government. If Naftali Bennett gets in the high teens or low 20s, that's a game changer. And there's been suggestions that Naftali Bennett would ask for rotation similar to the one that Netanyahu has with Gantz. And now, however much Netanyahu doesn't like the rotation system that he has with Gantz, he and his wife, who's a very important player, who certainly has personal history with Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, would prefer Gantz than Bennett any day of the week. So basically, it really puts Netanyahu onto the back foot and some of his other partners. It basically says to Netanyahu, if you go for elections, which is what he wants to do, what he wanted to do in December, when the time for passing a budget will exit, then he could well have Bennett sitting alongside him instead of Gantz, and Bennett will demand first rotation. He knows that if he demands second rotation, or not demands it, but he gets second rotation, like Gantz, he'll never see it. And that is something which obviously Netanyahu won't countenance. So basically, that really puts Netanyahu into a big quandary. And piling onto that is the situation with the ultra-Orthodox. At the moment, the ultra-Orthodox are the most secure partner, the most loyal partner of Netanyahu. And likewise, it goes in both directions. The ultra-Orthodox have been extremely unhappy about what Netanyahu and the government has been doing in the last few weeks, few months to their community, even though their community are showing by far the highest infection rates and continue to do so, whereas the rest of the country is now starting a trajectory down. They're continuing their trajectory of infection still up. And as you can imagine, during the High Holy Days, as we've seen in New York and other places, the ultra-Orthodox are persistent about praying in synagogues in large numbers, about having their celebrations, about having mass events, sometimes hundreds or thousands of people. And because there's been a massive outcry amongst the public, we see that there's been some level of police presence in these communities, and it's led to riots and really, really disgraceful scenes. And basically, they put out, when this poll came out to pile on Netanyahu's misery, one of the main Haredi parties, ultra-Orthodox parties, basically said to Netanyahu, if Bennett is going to get the same number as you, maybe he'll be our primary partner. And you can imagine that does not go down well in Balfour, the Prime Minister's residence, because it's a real threat. It is and it isn't. Do they really have the numbers to go with Bennett instead of Netanyahu? Not necessarily, but the fact that the threat is even there is a great worry for him. And what that basically says is to Netanyahu, it's about time you started treating us even better. And that's really where we are at the moment. There's a lot to talk about. The budget now has to be passed by the end of the year. Again, we go back to the old adage, which we've been talking about for months previously, before there was this extension, that Netanyahu wants a one-year budget, which will basically be a one-week budget because it will just be for the rest of 2020, whereas Gantz wants a budget also through 2021. Why that matters is because if there's only a budget for 2020, then there's 3 months until they have to pass another budget. And if that budget is not passed during that time, then Netanyahu can quell the government, can set the government aside and not have to give over his seat to Benny Gantz, which according to the coalition agreement, he has to. So there's a lot of things going on, but definitely the poll, regardless of whether it's meaningful, regardless of whatever else, it's changing the political map as we speak. It's changing the way Netanyahu sees the opportunity of elections. It's changing the way the ultra-Orthodox have now got a card to play over Netanyahu. It certainly puts blue and white, even though their poll results themselves are very poor. They're now into single digits, but it makes the likelihood of Netanyahu feel pressured and they're able to exert that pressure much higher. And it certainly puts Bennett in the driving seat, and he's the person to watch at the moment. So with that, I'm happy to talk about those issues or any others that you may have.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So first question is, why is Netanyahu wedded to the ultra-Orthodox? Why won't he consider a unity government consisting of the Likud, Yamina, and blue and white?
Well, it's relatively simple. The ultra-Orthodox are not multi-issue. Then there's two parties, but basically they agree on many. So I'm going to talk about them as one block. The ultra-Orthodox political parties are not multi-issue parties. They don't care too much about security issues. They don't care about diplomacy. They don't care about environmental issues or many of these other issues. as long as you give them what they want, which is a continued deferment from serving in the army, money for the yeshivot, stipends for large families, etc., etc. In other words, let them continue the way they are, also not forcing basic subjects like English and maths on them. Then basically they'll vote with you on every other issue. They're a very, again, if you give them what they want, they're relatively easy and stable power. I always talk about, I was working in government for two governments, one with the ultra-Orthodox, which lasted over 4 years, which I believe was the second or third longest government in the history of Israel. And then there was one attempt at a government with Yesh Atid, with what was then Yamina, Yeshua Beiteinu, a few others, and it lasted less than a year and a half, and there probably wasn't a day without a crisis. And that really showed Netanyahu. Netanyahu's main goal is stability, is ensuring and lengthening his stay in the prime minister's residence. And the ultra-Orthodox parties certainly made that much easier for him to do so. And that is why they're loyal to him and why he's loyal to them. He's been very good to them. He reversed a lot of steps that were taken during that one singular government without the ultra-Orthodox, where large family payments were lessened and many other things. He's reversed a lot of these trends. He's made sure that the issue of enlistment into the army for the ultra-Orthodox has never come to fruition, kicking the can down the road, even though the Supreme Court has said you must make a decision, you must pass a law on this issue. Netanyahu has been very good, very wily about making sure this issue really never comes to fruition. So there's a very strong loyalty based on shared interests, and the interests are quite simple. Netanyahu gets longevity, and the ultra-Orthodox parties get to keep their way of life, and that the government should continue paying for it. So with those two things in mind, it's a very strong marriage, let's say.
Speaking of the ultra-Orthodox, is there any way to quell their congregating during this time?
Again, it's very difficult. They are a community that come out in very large droves. They are a community which will go pretty far in demonstrations. We have seen violence. We've seen, policemen and even IDF soldiers who've had rocks thrown at them. They're called Nazis. All sorts of, they allow their children to the front lines. So then obviously the police look bad when they have to try and remove them. But also because, as I said before, which goes back to the previous question, it's whether there's a political will. And at this point in time, there's a far greater political will to disrupt the demonstrations which continue against Prime Minister Netanyahu than there are to stop the congregating in the ultra-Orthodox areas. I mean, if you go into an ultra-Orthodox areas, very narrow streets, very high population, very hostile crowd. These are communities which are very hostile to administrators, to police, law enforcement officials. I mean, you see it also to a lesser extent, perhaps in New York today. So it's very, very difficult, even if there is a political will. And I would argue that there isn't the strongest political will to quell these gatherings at this point. And there's even been talk, I can't confirm this, but there's even been talk that there's been discussions between government officials and law enforcement officials and some of the senior rabbinic leaders to sort of say, you can do what you want, but just make sure it doesn't get out. It's done behind closed doors. Again, those are rumors. There seems to be some legitimacy to it, but I can't say for sure. But that's basically where we are. So while these communities, the infection rates are just going up and up and up, and some openly, by the way, there are some senior rabbinic leaders who say, we're just trying to get to herd immunity. For us, even if there's a loss of life, even if there's illnesses, grave illnesses, it's much worse to shut down the synagogues, to shut down the yeshivot, than to be harmed by the coronavirus. And so when you're dealing with a community like that, it's very, very hard for law enforcement officials and even the government to get the message across that they have to stop these gatherings.
Thank you. Can you speak about the new Lebanese-Israeli talks that will be coming in the future about the borders by Rosh Hanikra?
Well, I don't think that these are not to the best of my knowledge, there's no border talks. There are disagreements between Lebanon and Israel over a very small Hardov area. But to the best of my knowledge, these are not ongoing discussions. The UN, although they've said that Israel did retreat, I believe it was in 2000, was it when Ehud Barak took Israel out of Lebanon in the early 2000s, that the UN did say that Israel went back to the blue line, which is the recognized international border. But Lebanon, or rather Hezbollah, claimed that there still was a small patch of land which was still officially, they deemed, part of Lebanon. And they use that as justification for continuing their presence in Lebanon, especially in the south. Could be you're talking about the maritime border. That's a whole other issue that's sort of woven into the gas fields that Israel's found. So there's that issue as well. And I think those are ongoing. They're not straight face-to-face negotiations, of course, because Lebanon doesn't recognize Israel, won't sit with Israel, but they're internationally brokered. But I believe there has been some progress there, but Israel's pretty insistent on its position on its maritime borders.
So the question we have in now is, with all these distractions, we read that additional housing plans for Yehuda and Shomron were advanced. Is construction going on over the Green Line, even though sovereignty has been put on hold?
Actually, no. Interestingly enough, again, sort of hurting or harming Netanyahu's right-wing credentials, it seems that one of the sort of side, I wouldn't say agreements, but understandings, as well as putting sovereignty on hold, is that there would be let's just call it a semi-unofficial freeze on new building. Obviously, there is ongoing construction that was green lighted, months and years ago. But certainly there's been a lowering in new projects, even to the point where Benny Gantz, who's considered to the left of Netanyahu, has basically, tried to call Netanyahu to unfreeze this. And there's been a bit of a debate amongst mayors in the settlements, Israeli communities in the Green Line, whether they should openly attack Netanyahu on this point or not. And there's a big disagreement on this, as there was on the postponement. Some would say pretty much crushing the sovereignty. So there hasn't really been that much building, if any, recently. And it seems to be that this very much is tied into the so-called Abraham Accords. And there's an understanding that Israel will certainly not be doing too much building in the foreseeable future in Judea and Samaria.
Speaking of the Accords, do you see any progress in near-term additional peace agreements?
Well, the one that seems to be ongoing, on and off, is Sudan. Sudan is basically tied into, we spoke about this previously. Sudan, their main goal here is to be taken off the sanctions list, especially led by America. That's their main goal. And America has tried to tie this into Sudan recognizing Israel. At one point they said they will. The next point they said they have no legitimacy because this is a transitional government in Sudan, and they said they have no legitimacy until after elections. Who knows when elections will be. But there seems to be some pushback on that. But at the end of the day, more important for Sudan, most important for Sudan, is the relinquishment of American sanctions against the country and against many of its leaders. And I think if they push hard enough, then certainly Sudan will go back on this. But again, we're talking about an American administration that is only a few weeks away from elections, so their attention level has dropped. There was an opportunity, there was talks, now they seem to be put off. So it's possible it won't happen for now. There doesn't seem to be any other nations immediately on the horizon, but one never knows what's going on behind closed doors. But definitely the region is changing by the day. Certain things that were not possible only a few months ago are certainly possible now. Direct flights between Israel and Morocco, that's another one. So it's even without a nation coming out specifically and saying we're formalizing relations with Israel, there are a lot of steps that have been taken every day by pragmatic Sunni nations in the region towards Israel that are pretty unprecedented.
there any implications to the El Al deal to Eli Rosenberg recently for Israelis?
Well, I'll be honest, I don't really know the details of that too much, but sorry, that's why I'll leave that particular question. I'm just not privy to the details too much of that, but obviously El Al is like many airlines and those involved with the industry itself are suffering, and there's a need for a bailout, possibly some sort of renationalization. I don't know exactly what's going on in that particular deal, but I'm sure when it's signed, there'll be lots of implications for Israel.
Understood. Will the EU insistence on PA accepting tax monies from Israel lead to further EU pressure on the Palestinian Authority to accept a peace deal or at least take steps towards the same?
No, I don't think this will lead to anything more. The EU is basically, the vast majority of the money that comes in from abroad comes in through what Israel collects in taxes for the Palestinian Authority. And ever since sovereignty was put on the table, the Palestinians decided to break off all relations with Israel's security, economic, and others. So even though Israel's been trying to give this money over, the Palestinians have resisted that, and they're suffering. The economy is suffering, the people are suffering, and the Europeans are saying, why should we bail you out when you're being stubborn on something which is rightfully yours? And for no good reason, because sovereignty is pretty much now off the table. But I don't think the Europeans would be able to put any more pressure. They do say that they want Israel and the Palestinians to return to the negotiating table, but if Mahmoud Abbas wants to come to the negotiating table, he got the EU pressure. There's enough pressure in the region now with his, within the Arab world. So I don't think there'll be significant pressure for any meaningful peace process at this point in time. In fact, if anything, there's reconciliation in the Palestinian Authority, or attempted reconciliation. And we've seen this story many, many times before, between what's called the factions, Fatah, which is Mahmoud Abbas's party, Hamas, and various others. There was talks of even having new elections. But we've heard this story many, many times. I think 15, 16 years since the last Palestinian elections, supposed to be, Mahmoud Abbas is 16 years into a 4-year term. And that doesn't seem like it's going to change because he knows the ramifications of actually holding elections. So he'll push as much as he can, but when it actually comes to significant substantive talk about elections, that's when things usually fall apart, as we've seen again in recent days.
So back to the elections, how likely do you think that a budget will be passed in the coming weeks?
It all comes down to one man, Prime Minister Netanyahu. He will be making his calculations. He'll be doing his own polling and understanding what is the threat of Bennett. What will elections really look like? And he's a very savvy politician, a very savvy what will be happening. And it's clear that he's losing a lot of support, but the question he has to ask himself is it preferable to go for elections now, when even if he is losing support, can one imagine how much less support he'll have in March, which is the other sort of earmarked date possibly for elections. Before then, he really will be locked into having to hand over the keys to Benny Gantz later in the year. So I think that's pretty much what everything depends on. Netanyahu's political considerations. He'll put his finger in the air to the wind and really think to himself, is it better to do it now, even if I weaken myself slightly? Maybe I can work around Bennett, but is March going to be better? Is coronavirus still going to be with us? Are some of the people unemployed or put on unpaid leave? Are they going to be back in work? That can affect him. We've talked many times. Netanyahu's base are people in the lower socioeconomic levels, and they will be suffering the most from the restrictions. Small businesses are closing every single day. Independent freelancers are not being able to work. Yes, there is money being dished out, but it's not enough. There's a lot of anger happening around the country. And So Netanyahu will have to think to himself, what's the situation likely to look like? Will we have another lockdown on top of that? There are people who are talking about another possible lockdown in January, February. So to have elections in March after another lockdown, with maybe even more people unemployed, the situation even worse, or could we have some sort of vaccine? Could we have strong treatments? Could we have more instant testing? Which, again, all of these things can lessen the burden and make sure that we can open up, businesses again. So these are all things Netanyahu is going to look at. Certainly, the poll that came out yesterday will have changed the calculations, not just for Netanyahu, but many, many people around it. As I said, it gives Benny Gantz a very strong hand because he knows Netanyahu will be far more wary of going to elections. It's very difficult to say. My feeling is that this may have changed it. This may have swung it slightly against going to elections at this point. And I'm sure Netanyahu will have explored other options of maybe getting out of the agreement without having to turn over the keys to Benny Gantz, maybe other opportunities. But I think it definitely makes the chances of elections that much weakened than they were the other day. And that's why this poll was really a very, very important and really calibrates the way many, many senior politicians are looking at the map today.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've come to the close of our webinar. Ashley, thank you again for taking the time to update us. For our viewers, please join us Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern for our next webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.